Welcome to HortTube, where we talk all things gardening. My name is Jim Putnam, and this is a dwarf burning bush. This is dwarf burning bush, a slow-growing deciduous shrub most noted for its fall, bright red foliage. Dwarf burning bush can reach 8 feet in height and probably 5 feet in width. It's kind of funny to call something a dwarf that gets 8 feet tall, but it's dwarf of a plant that gets 20 feet tall. So we call it a dwarf. It can reach 8 feet high. It's not the fastest growing thing in the world, so it would be really easy to keep this plant in the 4-foot range. I don't think you could probably keep it below that and have this really nice arching branch look that it has. Burning bush has a very wide growth range. These can grow all the way up to zone 4 in extremely cold winter temperatures, and then all the way down to zone 8. Dwarf burning bush is a slow growing shrub. We might get 4 inches of growth out of these in a single season. I think with or without fertilizer and with or without additional watering, that's about all we're going to be able to expect on these. The regular burning bush can grow a foot in a single season or maybe even more. In terms of sun or shade, the more sun the better on burning bush. The same thing with fire-powered andinas. If we put them in any shady conditions at all, they don't end up getting that bright fall color, which is kind of the purpose of this plant. I think the plant would grow in a little less than half a day sun, but what you'd end up with is a thin plant and very little of that fall color. In terms of usage of dwarf burning bush, these really look great mass planted. If you put them in a cluster of 5 or 7 in a corner, these are just absolutely fantastic. The more of them you have planted together, the more attention that they'll draw in the fall when they get the red foliage. It could be used as a foundation plant on a corner if you had a high space, where you could allow this thing to get 6 feet tall or more. These would also make a good screening plant. If you put them in a staggered row, the branching on these is actually pretty thick even without leaves in the winter time, so they actually do make a good buffer between you and a neighbor. Burning bush has an insignificant flower in the spring that eventually becomes a red berry in the fall, which the birds like. This is a great plant for birds foraging in the wintertime. Other features of burning bush, it has this beautiful lustrous green foliage, which of course as the nights get cooler in the fall becomes bright red, which is why it's called a burning bush. Eventually those leaves drop off and it has these amazing winged stems on it during the winter time. I actually think this plant with the red berries and the winged stems is more interesting in the winter than it is in the spring or summer. When we're planting burning bush, we're going to want to elevate these above the existing soil a little bit so we don't end up keeping them too wet. This is an extremely drought tolerant plant, but probably wouldn't be tolerant of sitting in wet soils. So we'll pull this thing out of the container, and almost certainly the roots will be very matted on one another. If you get a decent sized burning bush, it's been in that pot for a long time because these are pretty slow growing, it's going to be almost all roots around the exterior. We'll pull at those quite vigorously, and if you can't really pull them apart very well, you can take a knife and cut about a 1/2 inch in from top to bottom in 3 places, and that'll get the roots going outward in the future. Also, if you have heavy clay soils, you might want to use some pine bark soil conditioner. It's what we're growing these in. It's just a finely ground pine bark that's been composted for a little while. And we'll dig the clay out of the hole, mix 50% pine bark with that clay, and use that to replant our shrub. If you have sandier soils, even a coastal soil, you could use some compost or some peat moss that would allow you to hold a little more water in between rains. So we're going to dig the hole, the depth of the root ball. In this case, it might be about 10 inches. That soil is now sitting on the side of that hole that came out. We'll mix our amendment in with it, and then we'll put some of that back in the hole, in the bottom of it, so that when we pull this out and break up the roots and set it into the hole, it ends up sticking up about 2 inches above the original grade. Then we'll use the rest of our soil mix to pull up to the edge of that root ball, tamp it down, water it in well, and then lightly mulch this plant. Mulch it well in the bed, and then let it fade out, and don't cover the stems on the base of this plant. Don't cover anything that wasn't covered when you purchased it. In terms of watering burning bush, for the first 6 months or so, you're going to want to keep an eye on it. If it becomes abnormally dry, you'll drag a water hose to it. Once these are established, unless they have other root competition, meaning that they're planted near a tree line or something like that, they probably don't need a lot of ongoing water. If you win a month during the summer in a 90-degree span where we got no storms, no rain during the summer, you might drag a water hose to them. Saturate the whole area around it, especially if you have them mass planted. You could even run a soaker hose through it and then attach your hose to it and water them in really, really well. Saturate the whole area. Don't water them just at the base of the plant. Saturate the soil around them. That'll encourage them to root out into the surrounding soil. And when soil's really dry, if you just water right at the base of your plants, the surrounding soil will actually just take a lot of that water away. It'll just wick it right away from your plants anyway. So go ahead and saturate that space. In terms of fertilizer, I would fertilize these in the spring. Any kind of slow release outdoor fertilizer, especially something for acid-loving plants, would be preferable. And one application in the spring would be adequate. This is not the fastest growing plant, so no matter how much fertilizer you give it, you're probably not going to be able to push it very much. This is a plant that will creep up 4 or 5 inches a year until, it ends up being 6 feet one day, but it'll take years for that to happen with or without fertilizer. In terms of pruning any burning bush, these could actually be cut all the way to the ground. If they ever got too tall for you, they'll regenerate right from the base. It's kind of amazing that way. It'll be, of course, with the dwarf one, it'll be very, very slow to recover all that height. But if it ever got taller than you needed it, you could just cut it right in half. It's not that big of a deal. That's what I do on mine. I just cut it in half because I actually like the way it grows back. It has slightly weeping branches. I don't want to prune on this thing constantly. I wouldn't prune it to the exact height you want to keep it. I prune it 6 or 8 or inches or maybe a foot below where you want to keep it so that you can go a couple years letting it come back out and having a more natural look to it. We really don't see a lot of foliar problems on these. We might get a few chewing insects. They're just really not that big of a deal. The biggest pest on burning bush is definitely deer. Deer love these and they'll eat them halfway to the ground. They'll eat all of this year's growth at some point during the summer. So if you have deer problems, I wouldn't put these out on the edge of your yard. May not be a plant for you if you have deer foraging near your house. But for anyone else, it's really, really super low maintenance and very few insect or disease problems. So what are you waiting for? Even you can grow the bright red foliage, slow growing, low maintenance dwarf burning bush. Thank you for watching my videos. And if it was helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for future videos. Also comment below with any questions you might have about burning bush. Thank you.